Hello, everyone. I went ahead and bought the book. This is actually the first of three volumes. I have the other two volumes here as well. This printing is from, I think it was 1900, early 20th century. Of course, the postscript here is for October 18th, 1881. And then it gives the title, Memoirs of the Life of Mr. John Inglesant, sometime servant to King Charles I, with an account of his birth, education, and training by the Jesuits, and a particular relation of the secret services in which he was engaged, especially in connection with the late Irish Rebellion, with several other remarkable passages and occurrences, also a history of his religious doubts and experiences, and of the Malolness or quietus in Italy, in which country he resided for many years, with an account of the election of the late Pope and many other events and affairs. So 1902 in London is when this one was published. Nice photo of Shorthouse. And we have already read the introductory chapter as well as the first chapter. So I'm going to jump to following that. Remember that introductory chapter is signed by Jeffrey Monk, M.A., so it's a kind of framed narrative. Chapter 1. When Cromwell, Earl of Essex, was in the zenith of his power and was engaged in completing the suppression of the smaller monasteries before commencing on the greater, he had in his service a young gentleman named Richard Inglesant, the son of a knight and descended from a knightly family originally of Flanders, who had come into England with the Princess of Hainault. This young man was an attractive person, a scholar, active and useful in many ways, and therefore a favorite with his master. One evening in the end of June 1537, he was sent for by Cromwell into the great gallery of his magnificent house in Throgmorton Street, where he found his master walking up and down in thought. "You must be ready to depart at once, Richard," he said, "into Wiltshire. I have in this commission appointed you visitor of the Priory of Westacre, 6 miles south of Malmesbury, on the way into Somerset, which they call the Priory in the Wood. The King's Grace is resolved on the suppression of this house in the Priory, but note very carefully when I tell you, it will be for your guidance. Great interest has been made to His Grace's Highness on behalf of this house, both by many of the gentry dwelling thereabout, and also by the common people by the mouth of the Mayor of Malmesbury. They say the house is without any slander or evil fame, that it stands in a waste ground, very solitary, keeping such hospitality that except with singular good management it could not be maintained, though it had half as much land again as it has, such a number of the poor inhabitants nigh thereunto are daily relieved. The prior is a right honest man, and well beloved of all the inhabitants therewith adjoining, having with him in the house 8 religious persons, being priests of right good conversation, and living religiously. They spend their time in writing books with a very poor hand, and making garments for the poor people in printing or graving. Now the prayer of these people is that the King's Highness shall translate this priory into a college, and so continue as many of the priests as the lands will maintain for the benefit of the neighbors, and the king is much inclined to do this. Now, on the other hand, this house has a proper lodging, where the prior lay with a fair garden and an orchard, very meet to be bestowed on some friend of mine and some faithful servant of the king's grace. There is no small number of acres ready, sown with wheat, the tilth ordered for barley, the house and grounds are well finished with plate stuffed corn cattle, the woods well saved, and the hedgerows full of timber, as though the prior had looked for no alteration of his house. Sip of my coffee here. I had set mine hand on this house for a friend of mine, but the king's grace is determined upon this. If the prior will surrender the house in a discreet and frank manner, and will moreover on Sunday next, which is the feast of the most precious blood, after Mass, to which all the neighboring people shall have been called, in his sermon, make mention of the king's title of supreme head, and submit himself wholly in all matters spiritual to the king's grace, under Christ, the house shall be continued as a college, and no man therein disturbed, and not so much as an ounce of plate taken, that they may pray God Almighty to preserve the king's grace with his blessed pleasure. Now I send you on this mission, because if things go as I think they may, I mean this house for you. And there is so much clamor about this business that I will have no more hands in it than I can help. Take 2 or 3 of the men with you whom you can trust, but see you fail not in one jot in the course you take with the prior. For should it come to the king's ears that you had deceived the prior, it surely would so come to his grace. Your head would not be your own for an hour, and I should doubt even of my own favor with the king. Richard Inglesant was on horseback before daylight the next morning, and riding by easy stages, arrived at Malmesbury at last, and slept a night there, making inquiries about the way to Westacre. At Malmesbury and at all the villages where he stopped, he heard nothing but what agreed with what Cromwell had told him, and what he heard seemed to make him loiter still more, for he slept at Malmesbury a second night, and then did not go forward to Westacre till noonday. In the middle of the summer afternoon he crossed the brow of the hilly common, and saw the roofs of the priory beneath him surrounded by its woods. The country all about lay peaceful in the soft mellow sunlight, wide slopes of wood intermixed with shining water, and the quiet russet down stretching beyond. Richard had sent on a man the day before to warn the prior, who had been expecting his coming all day. The house stood with a little walled court in front of it, and a gatehouse, and consisted of 3 buildings, a chapel, a large hall, and another building containing the prior's parlor and other rooms on the ground floor, and a long gallery or dormitory above, out of which opened other chambers. The kitchens and stables were near the latter building on the right side of the court. The prior received Inglesant with deference, and took him over the house and gardens, pointing out the well-stocked fish ponds and other conveniences, with no apparent wish of concealing anything. Richard was astonished at the number of books, not only in the book room, but also in the prior's own chamber. These latter the prior seemed anxious he should not examine. As far as Richard could see, they were, many of them, chemical and magical books. He supped with the prior in hall with the rest of the household, and retired with him to the parlor afterwards, where cakes and spiced wine were served to them, and they remained long together. Inglesant delivered his commission fairly to his host, dwelling again and again on every particular, while the prior sat silent or made but short or inconclusive replies. At last Inglesant betook himself to rest in the guest chamber, a room hung with arras, opening from the gallery where the monk slept, towards the west. One of his servants slept also in the dormitory near his door. The prior's care had ordered a fire of wood on the great hearth that lighted up the carved bed and the hunting scene upon the wall. He lay long and could not sleep. All night long, at intervals, came the sound of chanting along the great hall and up the stairs into the dormitory. And as the monks sung the service of matins, lauds, and prime, his mind was ill at ease. A scholar and brought up from boyhood at the court, he had little sympathy with the new doctrines and held the simple and illiterate people who mostly followed them in small esteem. He was strongly influenced by the mysterious awe which the Romish system inspired in the most careless, even when it is not strong enough to influence their lives. The mission he had undertaken, and the probable destruction of this religious house, and the expulsion of its inmates for his benefit, frightened him and threatened him with unknown penalties and terrors hereafter which he dared not face. He lay listlessly on his bed, listening to the summer wind, and when at last he fell asleep, it was but a light, fitful slumber, out of which he woke ever and anon to hear the distant chanting of the monks, and see by the flickering firelight the great hounds coursing each other over the walls of his room. In the morning he heard Mass in the chapel, after which the prior sent a message to explain his absence, informing him that he was gone to Malmesbury to consult with his friends there how he might best serve the king's grace. All that morning Richard Inglesant sat in the hall receiving the evidence of all who came before him, of whom there was no lack, of the neighbors, gentry, and country people. He evidently examined them with a great care and acuteness, noting down every answer in a fair clerkly hand, exactly as he received it, neither extenuating anything nor adding the least word. He also, in the same report, kept an exact account of how he passed his time while at Westacre. There appears, as Cromwell had said, not to have been the least breath of scandal against the prior or any of the priests in the house. The only report at all injurious to the character of the prior seemed to have been an opinion, oftentimes hinted at by the witnesses, that he was addicted to the study of chemistry and magic, that besides his occult books he had in his closet in his chamber a complete chemical apparatus with which he practiced alchemy, and was even said to be in the possession of the elixir of life. These reports Inglesant does not appear to have paid much attention to, probably regarding them as not necessarily coming within the limits of his commission. And indeed, there is evidence of his having acted with the most exact fairness throughout the investigation, more than once putting questions to the witness, evidently for the purpose of correcting misapprehensions which told against the prior. After dinner he rode out to the downs to a gentleman who had courteously sent him word that he was coursing with greyhounds. He, however, was not absent from the priory long, declining the gentleman's invitation to supper. After he had supped, he spent the rest of the evening in his own chamber, reading what he calls Ovidii Nasonis Metamorphosios Libri Moralizati, an edition of which, printed at Leipzig in 1510, he had found in the prior's room. The next forenoon he spent in the same manner as the last, the people flocking in voluntarily to give their evidence in favor of the house. A little after noon the prior came back, traveling on foot and alone. As he came along, he was thinking of the words of the gospel, which promise great things to him who gives up houses and land for the Lord's sake. When he reached the brow of the hill from which he could see the 3 red tiled roofs of the priory peeping out from among the trees, with the gardens and the green meadows and the cattle seen here and there, he stood long to gaze. The air was soft and yet fresh, and the woods stretching up the rising grounds about the priory were wavering and shimmering all over with their myriad rustling leaves, instinct with life and beauty both to the ear and eye, a perpetual change from light to shadow, from the flight of the fleecy clouds would have made the landscape dazzling, but for the green on which the eye dwelt with a sense of rest to the wearied and excited brain. A gentle sound and murmur as of happy and contented beings made itself softly felt rather than heard through the noontide air. Omnes qui relinquunt patrum domus uxorem, said the prior, but his eyes were so dim that he stumbled as he went on down the hill.